In the chronicles of ancient Rome, few names inspire such revulsion, fascination, and disbelief as that of Gaius, Julius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, known to history by a childhood nickname that would become synonymous with madness. Caligula, the Little Boot. His story is not merely that of a tyrant, it is a tragic descent, a transformation of hope into horror, of a beloved son of Rome into the embodiment of divine delusion. To understand how such monstrosity took root, we must begin in the cradle of empire, among marble palaces and poisoned goblets. Rome at the dawn of the 1st century stood unmatched. Its legions stretched from the misty fields of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. The imperial dynasty, founded by Augustus, had turned conquest into art and power into religion. But beneath the glittering veneer of triumph lay the rot of paranoia. Every dinner, every gesture, every word at court might be a prelude to exile or death. This was the world into which young Caligula was born, a world where bloodlines guaranteed both privilege and peril. His father, Germanicus, was the Golden Prince of Rome, adored by the people and beloved by the army. His victories in Germania made him the ideal successor to Emperor Tiberius, who watched him with cold, calculating eyes. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended from Augustus himself, was proud, intelligent, and dangerously outspoken. In the empire of Tiberius, such qualities were often fatal. When Germanicus died suddenly, some said poisoned by Tiberius's agents, the flame of hope that lit Rome flickered out, leaving behind suspicion, whispers, and a family marked for extinction. The child who would be emperor grew up amid this shadowed tragedy. The soldiers called him Caligula Little Boot because he wore a miniature uniform, complete with sandals and armor, while marching beside his father's legions along the Rhine. They cheered when he toddled past the ranks, a living mascot of Rome's glory. The name was affectionate, then a token of innocence. But innocence, in Rome, never lasted long. As the years passed, the tides of fortune turned cruel. Caligula's mother was accused of treason and exiled to a barren island, where she starved herself to death rather than bend to Tiberius's will. His brothers, Nero and Drusus, met similar fates, one executed, the other imprisoned, until he wasted away. Caligula alone survived, not through power, but through performance. He learned to smile in the presence of the man who murdered his family. He learned the art of pretending to adore his captor, mastering the mask that would later become his weapon. Tiberius, haunted by his own ghosts, withdrew to the island of Capri, surrounding himself with astrologers, informants, and young men who were less companions than captives. He summoned Caligula to join him there, perhaps to keep his enemies closer, or perhaps because he saw in the boy a reflection of his own cruel curiosity. On that island of pleasure and paranoia, the young man absorbed the twisted lessons of absolute power, that fear was the purest form of loyalty, and mercy the surest path to ruin. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, possibly smothered by a servant or by Caligula himself, as some whispered, the Roman world erupted in celebration. The Senate, weary of the old emperor's tyranny, hailed Caligula as their savior. The legions proclaimed him the new Augustus. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Tiberius is dead! Long live Germanicus's son!" For the first time in years, Rome dared to hope. The new emperor was young, charismatic, the blood of heroes running through his veins. It seemed the gods had given Rome a second dawn, and at first, they were not wrong. Caligula began his reign with gestures of generosity that dazzled the empire. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and opened the imperial treasury to reward soldiers, rebuild temples, and feed the poor. He even published the imperial accounts, a stunning act of transparency in an age of secrets. The people adored him. The Senate bowed eagerly, mistaking charm for virtue. From the sands of Egypt to the forests of Gaul, Rome rejoiced. "The son of Germanicus has come to heal the empire," they said. In those early months, Caligula seemed the ideal ruler, eloquent, handsome, and radiant with youthful confidence. He presided over grand games at the Colosseum and ordered public banquets that lasted for days. Exotic animals from distant provinces, tigers, elephants, and black panthers were paraded through the streets, slaughtered for spectacle before cheering crowds. Caligula laughed louder than anyone, the sound echoing across the arena like the laughter of a god amused by human suffering. To the people, it was joy. To him, it was something deeper, discovery. It was during these performances that the first cracks appeared. Observers noticed that when the crowd's laughter faded, Caligula's did not. His eyes lingered too long on the dying gladiators, his delight too intense, too genuine. There were rumors that he returned to the arena at night, walking alone through the blood-soaked sand, whispering to the ghosts of the fallen. The man who once charmed the legions as a boy began to look upon death not as tragedy but as entertainment. Yet the empire still loved him. His portrait adorned coins, his statues filled the temples, and his name was sung like a hymn. Rome, exhausted by the gloom of Tiberius, mistook spectacle for salvation. They did not see that the young emperor's laughter had begun to curdle into madness. 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. Fever gripped him for days, his body writhing in agony, his mind slipping between life and death. Rome wept. Citizens kept vigil outside the palace, vowing to sacrifice their own lives if the gods would spare him. Senators prayed in public squares. Slaves offered incense at the altars of Jupiter. The city, united in devotion, waited for its emperor to recover. And he did, but the man who rose from that bed was not the same. The fever had burned away the last remnants of humanity. His eyes, once bright with charm, now gleamed with a cold, predatory light. His voice, formerly smooth and measured, carried a strange rasp that made listeners uneasy. He began speaking of visions of Jupiter himself, appearing to him in dreams, commanding him to rule as a god among men. He insisted he could hear divine whispers others could not. At first, his courtiers humored him. Soon, they learned that disbelief was fatal. The Caligula, who had once promised peace, now sought only to test the limits of pain. He began inventing punishments for trivial offenses, an insolent glance, a misplaced word. He claimed the gods delighted in human agony, and that he, as their earthly vessel, was duty-bound to provide it. Those who had once prayed for his recovery now prayed for his death, though never allowed. Rome had birthed a monster, and it was too late to unmake him. The transformation was not just physical or mental, it was spiritual, as if the illness had stripped away his mortal restraints and left only the divine arrogance that absolute power breeds. Caligula believed himself chosen by the gods, a new Jupiter incarnate, and all others mere actors in the theatre of his will. He began to test that belief on those closest to him, his family, his senators, his people, and so began the slow, terrifying descent from adored prince to living god, from savior to destroyer. The empire did not yet realize it, but the clock of madness had already begun to tick. When Caligula recovered from his mysterious illness, it was as if a new being had taken his place, a man possessed by divine madness. The laughter that once charmed Rome now echoed like a curse through marble corridors. The emperor no longer spoke to people. He spoke through them, as if they were instruments in the symphony of his own divinity. To his trembling court, he announced a revelation. The gods have chosen me as their equal. Jupiter speaks in my dreams. I am no longer a man. At first, his proclamations drew nervous smiles. But soon, those who hesitated to kneel were branded as traitors to heaven itself. Caligula began appearing before the Senate dressed as various gods, sometimes as Jupiter, clutching a thunderbolt, sometimes as Neptune, dripping in pearls and seaweed, and sometimes, scandalously, as Venus herself, his face painted, his body draped in silks. Senators were forced to bow and kiss his feet before speaking. Even the noblest of Rome's patricians learned to crawl. The empire that had once bowed before the law now bowed before the whims of one man. To disagree was blasphemy, to hesitate, death. But the emperor's descent into delusion reached its most shocking form through his obsession with his sister Drusilla, the one person he had truly loved. Beautiful, gentle, and intelligent, she had been his anchor during his early reign. Yet the bond between them began to twist into something forbidden. Caligula forced Drusilla to divorce her husband and live with him in the palace, calling her my wife, my goddess. Even Rome, a civilization with flexible morals, recoiled in disgust. When Drusilla died suddenly, perhaps of plague, perhaps of poison, the emperor's grief turned apocalyptic. He declared her a living deity, erected temples in her name, and made it a capital crime to question her divinity. For months, laughter was outlawed in Rome. Citizens mourned in silence, knowing that one misplaced smile could mean execution. The city became a graveyard of whispers, and in its heart sat a man who called himself a god. Caligula's isolation deepened. The Senate, terrified yet resentful, plotted in shadows. The Praetorian Guard obeyed out of fear, not loyalty. Inside the palace, night after night, new rumors spread of cruelty, of humiliation, of pleasures so obscene that even Rome's most jaded courtiers blanched. The imperial banquets became infamous. Senators and their wives were summoned without warning to dine at the emperor's table. There, amid golden candles, the true theater of his madness unfolded. Caligula would praise a senator's wife for her beauty, then demand she follow him into another chamber, often returning moments later with her hair disheveled and her eyes hollow. The husband was expected to smile and thank the emperor for his favor. To frown was treason. To cry was death. The palace became a brothel of power. Nobles were forced to watch their wives, daughters, and even sons violated under the emperor's gaze. The walls of marble echoed not with music but with muffled screams. Caligula, seated on a gilded chair, would judge these acts like a high priest of depravity, declaring that his pleasures were divine rituals sanctioned by Jupiter. In his mind, the empire's sins had become sacraments. The historian Suetonius later wrote that Caligula turned the imperial household into a house of shame. But the truth was worse. It was not lust alone that drove him, but domination. Each act of humiliation reaffirmed that he, and he alone, held power over life, death, and dignity. Outside the palace, Rome began to suffocate under his extravagance. The vast fortune left by Tiberius vanished within a year, swallowed by games, feasts, and monuments. When the treasury ran dry, Caligula invented new taxes. He taxed marriages, lawsuits, and even the privilege of breathing in his presence. He auctioned off the wives of senators to raise money, then publicly mocked their husbands for buying them back. He revived the dreaded treason trials, accusing wealthy citizens of plotting against his divine person, confiscating their estates before condemning them. "The gods demand sacrifice," he would say, as yet another nobleman was dragged to execution. In truth, it was not the gods who demanded, but his appetite for gold. And yet, amid all this madness, Caligula still craved grandeur. He wanted to outshine every emperor, every conqueror, even the gods themselves. To prove his supremacy, he ordered the construction of a colossal bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 4 kilometers long, built solely so he could gallop across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. Thousands of workers died to fulfill this absurd vision, their bodies buried beneath the waves. When the bridge was complete, Caligula rode triumphantly across it, declaring himself master of the sea. Then, as quickly as he had conceived it, he ordered it dismantled. But even that was not enough. He turned next to his favorite companion, his horse, Incitatus. The animal lived in a marble stable with an ivory manger, drank wine from golden bowls, and had its own staff of servants. One day, Caligula announced he would make Incitatus a consul of Rome, the highest civil office in the empire. The Senate laughed nervously, unsure if it was a jest or an order. But it was no joke. The emperor was showing them, with pitiless clarity, that a horse was worth more than any of them. Behind this grotesque comedy lay a growing terror. Rome's economy crumbled. Farmers were ruined by endless taxes, soldiers went unpaid, trade ships rotted in harbors, but none dared complain. To criticize was to die. Even the gods were not safe from Caligula's derangement. He ordered their statues' heads replaced with his own likeness, declaring that worship of Jupiter was obsolete. There was now only Caligula, the living god. At night, he would ascend to the roof of his palace and address the heavens directly. "Come down, Jupiter," he shouted. "Fight me for the throne of Olympus." Lightning struck once near the Palatine Hill, and Caligula, convinced the god had answered, spent the next day boasting of his victory. He built a temple to himself the next week. Citizens were forced to offer sacrifices to his statue, praying not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to the emperor himself. It was more than blasphemy. It was terror disguised as faith. The Senate trembled. Mothers taught their children to never speak his name. Slaves crossed themselves when passing the palace. Rome, once the beacon of civilization, had become a vast stage for a single man's delusion. By the 3rd year of his reign, the city stank of fear and decay. Caligula's madness had infected the heart of the empire, every law twisted, every virtue inverted. What had begun as the hopeful reign of a beloved prince now stood revealed as a nightmare of divine cruelty. The people whispered prayers not for salvation, but for deliverance. And somewhere, deep within the ranks of his own Praetorian Guard, the first seeds of vengeance began to stir. By the year 40 AD, the empire had become the stage for Caligula's divine theatre, an unending performance of madness, vanity, and blood. Yet the emperor, restless even in omnipotence, sought new worlds to conquer. Having exhausted the pleasures of Rome, he turned his gaze outward to the legions, to war, to glory. But what followed was not conquest. It was farce dressed in armor. Caligula proclaimed himself the greatest general in Roman history. He boasted that Alexander the Great's ghost had visited him in a dream and demanded that he surpass his achievements. In a frenzy of megalomania, he assembled legions for a grand campaign in Germania. Soldiers, hardened by real wars, marched beneath banners embroidered with his divine image. But the campaign dissolved into absurdity. Instead of battle, Caligula ordered mock victories. He had his men charge empty hills, then proclaim triumph. He punished commanders who hesitated to win imaginary wars, and executed scouts who returned with truthful reports. At one point, he declared he had conquered the sea itself, and commanded his legions to march to the shore and collect seashells as the spoils of war. These, he announced, are the treasures of Neptune, trophies from the ocean I have subdued. To his soldiers, it was humiliation beyond endurance. Veterans of real campaigns, men who had bled at the Rhine and Danube, were now forced to fill their helmets with seashells while their emperor laughed. But desertion meant death, and loyalty had become slavery in all but name. Caligula's treatment of his officers grew even more deranged. He forced centurions to run beside his chariot for miles under the blazing sun, killing any who faltered. He made generals crawl in the mud for amusement, calling it training in humility. In one grotesque spectacle, he executed a cohort simply because their marching did not please him. The Roman army, once the disciplined machine that conquered the world, was now reduced to the personal circus of a mad god. His delusion of divine power deepened. He began halting armies mid-march to confer with Jupiter, standing in silence for hours while his soldiers waited, trembling, for orders that never came. He built altars on battlefields, declaring that only through blood could the empire remain pure. But the only blood spilled was Roman. When he announced plans to invade Britannia, hope briefly flickered that he might restore his reputation. Yet at the moment of departure, he halted the expedition, claiming that Neptune himself had forbidden it. Refusing to appear defeated, he staged a mock triumph upon his return to Rome. Chariots rolled through the streets. Prisoners were paraded, though they were not Britons but captured slaves dressed in blue paint. The people cheered because they were ordered to, and because silence was death. But behind the cheers, the empire trembled. Even those closest to Caligula now realized that his reign was unsustainable. He had mocked the gods, emptied the treasury, humiliated the legions, and turned the nobility into beggars. The Senate despised him, the people feared him, and even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, began to whisper in corridors. The man they guarded was no longer an emperor, he was a disease eating Rome from within. Among those who could endure no more was Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer of the guard. Caligula had made him the butt of endless jokes, mocking his soft voice, and forcing him to use obscene passwords like Venus or Priapus. Each insult deepened his resolve. Around him gathered men of every rank and motive, senators whose families had been executed, soldiers dishonored, freedmen who had lost everything. They shared only one purpose: to end the reign of terror before the empire itself perished. The plan was laid with military precision. Caligula's habits were well known: his meals, his baths, his private walks beneath the palace. They would strike during the Palatine Games, when the emperor's attention was consumed by performance. Ironically, the theatre he so loved would become the site of his own final act. On January 24th, 41 AD, the emperor arrived at the theatre in his usual splendor, attended by guards and courtiers. He laughed as actors reenacted tales of betrayal and divine vengeance, oblivious to the dark symmetry unfolding. As the final play ended, he rose to leave, choosing a narrow underground corridor, a shortcut to his palace. The conspirators waited in its shadow, blades drawn. Cassius Chaerea was the first to step forward. His voice, steady at last, called out the password Caligula had given him, Jupiter. Then he struck. The blade tore through flesh and silk. The emperor gasped in disbelief. More blows followed 10, 20, 30, each one fueled by years of humiliation, fear, and rage. The man who had called himself a god fell to his knees, choking on his own blood. His final words, according to Suetonius, were chilling in their irony. "I am still alive," a final delusion, shattered by steel. Outside, chaos erupted. Some guards rushed to avenge their emperor. Others joined the assassins. The Senate, hearing the news, panicked, unsure whether to celebrate or flee. For hours, the fate of the empire hung in uncertainty. Finally, a Praetorian patrol discovered Claudius, Caligula's uncle, trembling behind a curtain in the palace. Desperate for order, they hailed him emperor. Thus ended the reign of Caligula, not with rebellion or civil war, but with a whispered conspiracy in a dark hallway. When dawn came, the people of Rome awoke to silence. No decrees, no trumpets, no sacrifices to the living God. Only the rumor spreading like wildfire. The tyrant is dead. The city did not rejoice openly. Fear was still too deep. But in the markets, in the temples, in the barracks, a quiet relief took root. For the first time in years, Rome could breathe. The Senate ordered Caligula's name erased from every monument, every record, every coin. His statues were toppled, his inscriptions chiseled away. This damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was meant to erase him from history. But paradoxically, it preserved him forever. For the harder Rome tried to forget, the more indelible his shadow became. Historians like Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio struggled to comprehend him. Some saw disease, others pure evil. Modern minds would call him a narcissist, a psychopath, a man destroyed by inherited trauma and limitless power. But all agreed on one truth. His reign revealed the fragility of civilization itself. Rome survived Caligula, but not unscarred. The empire's faith in divine rulers had been broken, its confidence shaken. The dream of benevolent emperorship had turned into a nightmare of godlike cruelty. In the centuries that followed, tyrants from Nero to Commodus would echo his madness, each proving the same eternal truth, that unchecked power is the surest path to corruption. In the ruins of his palace, the marble floors once stained with blood gleamed again under new emperors. Yet, even as Rome rebuilt itself, an invisible scar remained the memory of a man who believed himself divine and dragged an empire to the brink of hell to prove it. For Caligula's legacy was not only horror, it was a warning. A reminder that no civilization, however mighty, is immune to the madness of its rulers. That the line between man and monster can vanish in a heartbeat, and that the gods, in their cruel humor, sometimes grant us exactly what we wish for, only to show us the cost of our worship. The tyrant had fallen, but his echo endured, and so history remembers him not as a god, nor even as a man, but as a mirror held to humanity's darkest truth.